July 5, 1943. Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Oberst Karl Decker stood in the turret of his Panther OSF. Watching the pre-dawn mist lift across the steppe. Around him, 200 Panthers of the 51st and 52nd Panzer battalions prepared for Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. These were the first Panthers to see combat, the technological response to the Soviet T-34 that had shocked German panzer forces 2 years earlier. This is the weapon that will restore German armor superiority, Decker told his crew. The Panther has the best gun, the best armor, the best engineering of any tank in the world. Today, we will destroy the Soviet tank forces and prove that German technology cannot be beaten. The crews had been told the Panther was invincible. The 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The sloped armor, copied from the T-34 but improved by German engineering, was nearly impervious to Soviet anti-tank weapons. The Maybach HL-230 engine provided 700 horsepower, giving the 45-ton tank excellent mobility. What Decker and his crews didn't know was that of the 200 Panthers assembled for Kursk, fewer than 40 would still be operational after 3 days of combat, not because of Soviet fire, but because transmissions failed, engines caught fire, final drives broke, and suspensions collapsed. Within a week, the vaunted Panther battalions would be combat ineffective, not from enemy action, but from mechanical breakdowns that German engineering had failed to anticipate. And over the next 2 years, this pattern would repeat across every front where Panthers operated. Of 6,000 Panthers built during the war, mechanical failures would destroy more tanks than all Allied anti-tank weapons combined. The Panther, designed to dominate the battlefield through technical superiority, would instead become a monument to over-engineering, inadequate testing, and the strategic failure of prioritizing perfection over reliability. This is the story of how German engineering excellence became German strategic liability, how the pursuit of the perfect tank created a maintenance nightmare, and how the Panther, possibly the best designed tank of World War II, was defeated more by its own complexity than by enemy fire. The Panther emerged from the crisis of confidence that swept through the German panzer forces after encountering Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks in summer 1941. The T-34 shocked German tank commanders. It was faster than German tanks, better armored, and mounted a gun that could destroy German tanks at ranges where German guns were ineffective. The KV-1 was nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons. A commission of German officers and engineers was sent to the Eastern Front to study captured Soviet tanks and develop a response. Their conclusion was unanimous. Germany needed a new medium tank incorporating T-34 features, sloped armor, wide tracks for mobility, and a powerful high-velocity gun. 2 manufacturers, MAN, Maskin & Fabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, and Daimler-Benz, submitted competing designs. The Daimler-Benz design closely resembled the T-34, featuring a diesel engine, rear drive sprocket, and compact layout. The MAN design was more conventional, gasoline engine, front drive sprocket, and torsion bar suspension similar to existing German tanks. Hitler personally selected the MAN design in May 1942, despite the Daimler-Benz proposal's advantages. The decision reflected German engineering culture. The MAN design was more sophisticated, more complex, and theoretically superior. The Daimler-Benz design was simpler and easier to produce, which made it seem inferior to German engineers trained to value technical complexity as a measure of quality. The final Panther design, designated PZKPFWV Panther, was a masterpiece of tank engineering. The 75mm KWK 42L/70 gun was the most powerful tank gun in operational service, capable of penetrating 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The sloped frontal armor, 80mm thick at 55 degrees, provided effective protection equivalent to 140mm of vertical armor. The interleaved road wheel suspension distributed weight better than conventional designs, providing excellent ride quality and cross-country performance. On paper, the Panther was the best tank in the world. a combined firepower exceeding the Soviet T-34, armor protection superior to the American Sherman, and mobility that matched or exceeded both. German engineers had created exactly what the specifications demanded, a tank that could dominate any opponent through technical superiority. But the engineering excellence that made the Panther formidable on paper created catastrophic problems in practice. The complexity that German engineers viewed as sophistication became a maintenance nightmare that German mechanics couldn't manage under field conditions. The Maybach HL-230 engine, while powerful, was temperamental and prone to overheating. The transmission required to handle the engine's 700 horsepower while moving a 45-ton vehicle was underdesigned and failed regularly, often within the first 150 kilometers of operation. The final drives, connecting the transmission to the drive sprockets, were inadequate for the stresses imposed and broke frequently. The interleaved road wheels, while providing excellent ride quality, became packed with mud and froze solid in winter conditions, immobilizing tanks overnight. German testing procedures, normally thorough, were rushed for the Panther. Hitler demanded the tank enter production immediately despite engineers requesting more time for trials. The first production Panthers rolled off assembly lines in January 1943 with known defects that engineers hadn't had time to correct. The Panther was rushed into combat at Kursk just 6 months after production began, far too soon for proper testing and crew training. Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943, with the largest tank battle in history. The Panthers of XLVI Panzer Corps were assigned critical roles, breaking through Soviet defenses and exploiting into the rear areas. The first day revealed the catastrophic consequences of inadequate testing. Of 200 Panthers that started the offensive, mechanical failures reduced operational strength to fewer than 160 by evening of the first day. Transmissions failed, engines overheated and caught fire, final drives broke. Panthers were abandoned after traveling only a few kilometers, not because of Soviet fire, but because they simply stopped functioning. Oberst Decker, whose Panther had broken down after 20 kilometers when the transmission failed, watched recovery vehicles struggling to retrieve disabled tanks while Soviet artillery rained down. We were told these were the best tanks ever built. Instead, we discovered they were mechanical disasters. My battalion started with 96 Panthers. After one day, we had 43 operational. By day 3, we had 10. Most weren't destroyed by Russians, they destroyed themselves. Crews would report, transmission failed, engine fire, final drive broken. The recovery units couldn't keep up. The Soviet defenders, initially alarmed by reports of new German heavy tanks, quickly realized the Panthers were vulnerable not to Soviet fire, but to their own complexity. Soviet after-action reports noted, new German Panther tanks demonstrate superior firepower and armor protection, but suffer from severe mechanical problems. Many Panthers observed abandoned due to breakdown rather than combat damage. Recommend targeting disabled Panthers with artillery to prevent recovery and repair. The Panthers' combat debut at Kursk was a technical disaster that German propaganda tried desperately to conceal. Official reports emphasized a few Panthers that performed well while obscuring the mechanical failure rate that rendered the battalion's combat ineffective. But frontline commanders knew the truth. The Panther was not ready for combat and had been committed prematurely due to Hitler's impatience. The fundamental problems that doomed the Panther at Kursk persisted throughout the war despite continuous modifications. The transmission remained a weak point through all variants. The final drives continued breaking regularly. The engine continued overheating, particularly in summer operations. The interleaved wheels continued causing problems in mud and winter conditions. Each Panther variant, OSF, D, A, and G, attempted to address these problems. The OSF A, introduced in August 1943, featured improved transmission and new cupola. The OSF G, introduced in March 1944, featured further transmission improvements, simplified hull, and redesigned hull sides. But the improvements were incremental, and none solved the fundamental problems that the design's complexity created. The maintenance burden of keeping Panthers operational exceeded German logistical capacity. A Panther required approximately 20 hours of maintenance for every hour of operation, a ratio that was sustainable in peacetime or during periods of static defense, but impossible to maintain during combat operations. Panzer divisions equipped with Panthers spent more time repairing tanks than fighting with them. The spare part situation was catastrophic. The Panther's complexity meant it required hundreds of unique parts that weren't interchangeable with other German tanks. Supply chains, already strained by Allied bombing and overextension across multiple fronts, couldn't deliver parts fast enough. Mechanics often cannibalized broken Panthers to keep others operational. By late 1944, many Panzer units had more Panthers awaiting parts than Panthers operational. The crew training issues compounded the mechanical problems. The Panther required skilled drivers who understood how to manage the temperamental transmission and engine. Improper shifting could destroy the transmission within kilometers. Improper engine management could cause fires. But as German casualties mounted, replacement crews received inadequate training, weeks instead of months, and frequently destroyed Panthers through improper operation. Hauptmann Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank aces who commanded both Tigers and Panthers, described the Panther's mechanical unreliability. The Panther was potentially the best tank of the war, but only potentially. In practice, it was a maintenance nightmare that spent more time in repair than in combat. I lost more Panthers to mechanical failure than to enemy fire by a ratio of at least 3-to-1. The worst part was never knowing if your tank would function when needed. You could have a perfectly running Panther drive 50 kilometers, and suddenly the transmission would fail for no apparent reason. The operational readiness rates tell the story starkly. A well-maintained Panther unit in defensive positions might achieve 70 to 80% operational readiness. But during offensive operations or extended movement, readiness rates collapsed to 30 to 40% or lower. A Panzer division equipped with 90 Panthers might have only 30 operational at any given time, with the remainder awaiting repair, parts, or recovery. The comparison with American Sherman tanks was instructive. The Sherman was mechanically simple, used proven automotive components, and could be maintained by mechanics with basic training. Sherman operational readiness rates routinely exceeded 90%. A Sherman battalion might lose tanks to combat, but rarely lost tanks to mechanical failure. The Americans could afford to lose Shermans in combat because they had so many, but they rarely lost them to breakdowns. The Germans couldn't afford to lose Panthers in combat and were losing them to mechanical failures constantly. The Soviet T-34 comparison was even more stark. The T-34 was crewed by German engineering standards, rough finish, uncomfortable crew conditions, imprecise manufacturing. But it was mechanically robust, easy to repair, and simple enough that minimally trained crews could operate it effectively. T-34 operational readiness rates exceeded 80% even during intense combat operations. Soviet tank factories were producing tanks faster than combat losses could consume them. German Panther factories were producing tanks that broke down faster than mechanics could repair them. The winter of 1943 to 44 on the Eastern Front revealed the Panther's cold weather vulnerability. The interleaved road wheel suspension, while providing excellent ride quality in summer, became a death trap in winter. Mud collected between the overlapping wheels, then froze overnight. Crews would wake to find their Panthers immobilized. The wheels couldn't turn because ice locked them solid. The solution was brutal. Light fires under the wheels to melt the ice, a process taking hours and requiring flammable materials that were scarce. German crews spent hours every morning de-icing their Panthers before they could move. Soviet tanks with conventional suspensions didn't have this problem. They simply started their engines and moved. Major Franz Bake, commanding a Panther battalion during the winter retreat from Ukraine, reported, "We are losing more tanks to ice than to Soviet action. Panthers that are perfectly functional become immobilized overnight when temperatures drop. We've resorted to keeping engines running continuously to generate heat, but fuel consumption becomes prohibitive. The alternative is spending hours de-icing each morning while Soviet forces advance. The interleaved suspension that supposedly provides superior mobility has become our greatest liability. The Normandy campaign demonstrated that Panther mechanical unreliability wasn't limited to Eastern Front conditions. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and Panzerlehr Division, equipped with Panthers, experienced catastrophic mechanical failure rates during combat in France. The long road march from assembly areas to the invasion front consumed Panthers through mechanical attrition. Of 98 Panthers that Panzerlehr Division began moving toward Normandy on June 7th, only 42 reached the front operational. The remainder broke down during the march, transmissions failed, engines overheated, final drives broke. Allied air attacks destroyed some, but mechanical failures accounted for the majority of losses. The bocage terrain of Normandy was particularly brutal on Panther drivetrains. The constant maneuvering, frequent gear changes, and operation in confined spaces stressed transmissions beyond their limits. Panthers that had survived hundreds of kilometers on Eastern Front steppes broke down after days in Norman hedgerows. SS Obersturmbannführer Kurtmeyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, expressed bitter frustration in his war diary. "We have Panthers that can destroy any Allied tank from 2,000 meters. But we can't get them to the battle because they break down en route. When they reach the battle, they break down after hours of combat. We spend more time recovering and repairing Panthers than fighting with them." The mechanical unreliability negates the technical superiority. The Allied tank crews facing Panthers quickly learned to recognize disabled vehicles. A Panther sitting immobile wasn't necessarily destroyed. It was probably broken down. Experienced crews would bypass disabled Panthers, knowing German recovery vehicles would be along eventually to retrieve them. Why waste ammunition on a tank that had already defeated itself? The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the final demonstration of Panther unreliability under combat conditions. The German offensive depended on rapid armored advance before American reinforcements could arrive. Panthers were assigned critical roles: breakthrough, exploitation, and screening. The 2nd Panzer Division, equipped with Panthers, exemplified the pattern of mechanical failure undermining tactical success. The division started the offensive with 90 Panthers. After 3 days, 51 were operational. After 1 week, 27 remained. Of the 63 Panthers lost, Allied fire accounted for perhaps 20. The remainder were abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. The fuel shortage exacerbated mechanical problems. Panthers consumed fuel prodigiously, roughly 2 liters per kilometer on roads, far more cross-country. The German plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps, but as Panthers broke down and consumed precious fuel, mobility decreased. By late December, many Panthers were abandoned simply because there was no fuel to continue operations and no recovery vehicles available to retrieve them. The Americans, advancing after the German offensive collapsed, found hundreds of abandoned German tanks, many of them Panthers that showed no combat damage. Intelligence teams examining these vehicles documented the failure modes: broken transmissions, seized engines, fractured final drives, damaged suspensions. The reports concluded that German armor was being defeated as much by mechanical unreliability as by Allied action. The production statistics reveal the strategic impact of Panther mechanical unreliability. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers between 1943 and 1945. This represented enormous investment. The Panther cost 117,000 Reichsmarks to produce versus 103,000 for a Panzer IV. Each Panther consumed resources equivalent to roughly 1.5 conventional tanks. But the return on investment was poor. Of 6,000 Panthers produced, combat records suggest that mechanical failures destroyed or required abandonment of over 3,000, more than half. Allied fire accounted for perhaps 2,000 Panthers. The remaining 1,000 were captured, scrapped, or otherwise disposed of at war's end. The comparison with simpler German tanks was damning. The Panzer IV, Germany's workhorse medium tank, was mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, and adequately armed for most combat situations. Panzer IV operational readiness rates consistently exceeded Panther rates by 20 to 30 percentage points. German Panzer divisions might have been more effective with larger numbers of reliable Panzer IVs than with smaller numbers of unreliable Panthers. The Panther's technical sophistication, which German engineers viewed as advancement, was actually strategic liability. The 75mm gun was superb but required precision manufacturing that strained production capacity. The sloped armor was excellent but required complex fabrication. The interleaved suspension was sophisticated but maintenance-intensive. The Maybach engine was powerful but temperamental. Every component represented the German engineering philosophy of optimizing for maximum performance rather than adequate performance with maximum reliability. This philosophy worked for small production runs of specialized equipment. It was catastrophic for mass-produced weapons that needed to function reliably under field conditions with minimal maintenance. The crew survivability irony was that Panthers were actually relatively safe for their crews compared to other German tanks. The internal layout and armor protection meant that crew casualties in disabled Panthers were lower than in other types. But this was cold comfort when Panthers were disabled so frequently. Crews might survive, but they were repeatedly rendered combat ineffective by mechanical failures that left them stranded. The post-war interrogations of German officers revealed universal acknowledgement of Panther mechanical problems. General Heinz Guderian, who had commanded Panzer forces throughout the war, stated, "The Panther was the finest tank on the battlefield when it was working, but it was working far less often than it should have been. We would have been better served by simpler, more reliable tanks produced in greater numbers." The Panther's complexity was a luxury Germany couldn't afford. Every hour mechanics spent repairing Panthers was an hour the tank wasn't fighting. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, acknowledged in his memoirs that the Panther program consumed disproportionate resources. The Panther required more man-hours to produce than simpler tanks, more skilled workers to assemble, more resources to build, and more mechanics to maintain. The return on this investment was disappointing because so many Panthers were lost to mechanical failure rather than combat. We might have equipped our Panzer divisions with twice as many reliable tanks if we had accepted adequate performance rather than pursuing perfect performance. The technical analysis of why Panthers failed so frequently reveals fundamental engineering mistakes. The transmission was inadequately designed for the loads imposed. It was essentially a modified Panzer IV transmission, trying to handle 40% more power and 50% more weight. The final drives suffered similar problems. Components designed for lighter vehicles were adapted to the Panther rather than designing purpose-built components. The Maybach engine, while powerful, was pushed to its limits continuously. The Panther was underpowered for its weight. The power-to-weight ratio was adequate, but left no margin for the increased loads of combat operations. Sustained high-speed operation, frequent in combat, overheated the engine and led to fires. The engine's complexity made field repairs difficult. What should have been simple maintenance required specialized tools and skilled mechanics. The quality control problems that plagued late-war German production affected Panthers severely. As Allied bombing disrupted production and Germany's situation became desperate, quality declined. Panthers produced in 1945 were measurably less reliable than 1943 production, not because of design changes, but because manufacturing standards collapsed under pressure of rushed production, inadequate materials, and use of forced labor. The crews who operated Panthers developed love-hate relationships with the vehicles. They loved the firepower. The 75mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. They loved the armor protection. Panthers could shrug off hits that would destroy Panzer IVs. But they hated the unreliability, the constant breakdowns, the knowledge that their tank might fail at any moment. Lieutenant Hermann Bix, who commanded a Panther in the final defense of Berlin, expressed the frustration. "I loved and hated my Panther. When it worked, it was magnificent. We destroyed Soviet T-34s at ranges where they couldn't hurt us. The armor saved our lives repeatedly. But we broke down constantly. We spent more time broken than fighting. In our last week, we were operational for maybe 3 days total. The rest was spent repairing the transmission, replacing a final drive, fixing the engine. We surrendered in a Panther that was mechanically perfect. We just finished repairs when the war ended. All that work, all that maintenance, and we never got to use it because the war was over. The final assessment must acknowledge that the Panther's design was brilliant conceptually. A tank with that gun, that armor, and adequate mechanical reliability would have been devastating. But mechanical reliability was never achieved. The complexity that made the Panther potentially dominant made it actually vulnerable, not to enemy fire, but to its own engineering. The strategic lesson that militaries drew from the Panther was that reliability matters more than performance in weapons designed for mass production. Post-war tank design emphasized mechanical simplicity, automotive components proven in civilian use, and maintainability by average mechanics with basic tools. The sophisticated engineering that characterized the Panther gave way to pragmatic engineering that prioritized function over perfection. The surviving Panthers, a handful preserved in museums, are monuments to German engineering excellence and German strategic failure. They represent the peak of 1940s tank design and the futility of perfection pursued at the expense of reliability. They are beautiful, sophisticated machines that failed in their mission not because they were defeated in combat, but because they couldn't reach combat reliably. German engineers built the Panther to dominate the battlefield through technical superiority. They created a tank with the best gun, the best armor, and sophisticated systems. But they created a tank so complex that it couldn't be maintained under field conditions, so demanding that crews couldn't operate it without extensive training, and so unreliable that mechanical failures destroyed more Panthers than all Allied armies combined. The Panther story is the story of how engineering excellence becomes strategic liability when reliability is sacrificed for performance, how complexity defeats sophistication when support infrastructure is inadequate, and how the pursuit of the perfect weapon can create weapons that fail before they ever face the enemy. The Panther was potentially the best tank of World War II. In practice, it was a magnificent failure, defeated more often by its own complexity than by enemy fire, destroyed more often by breakdowns than by combat, and rendered ineffective more by German engineering philosophy than by Allied action. The final irony is that the Panther's technical descendants, post-war tanks like the Leopard 1 and Leopard 2, learned from these failures and became some of the most successful tanks ever built. But they succeeded by emphasizing the reliability that the Panther lacked, by using proven components that the Panther eschewed, and by accepting adequate performance over perfect performance. The Panther's legacy is the lesson that perfect is the enemy of good, that reliability beats sophistication, and that the best tank is the one that works when needed, not the one that works perfectly when it works at all.